December 1968, the Talk of the Town nightclub, London. Judy Garland was scheduled to perform at 9 p.m., but by 9:30 the stage remained empty. The audience, packed into the intimate venue, grew restless. Some had paid significant money to see the legend. Others had traveled from across Europe. They whispered among themselves, wondering if she would appear at all. At 9:47 p.m., a frail woman emerged from backstage. She looked nothing like the vibrant Dorothy from 3 decades earlier. At 46 years old, Judy appeared decades older, her body ravaged by years of addiction and abuse. But when she reached the microphone and opened her mouth to sing, something remarkable happened. The voice that emerged was broken, yes, but it carried an emotional truth that left the audience in stunned silence. What happened during that final series of performances revealed something about Judy Garland that all the Hollywood scandals had obscured. This wasn't just the story of a fading star. This was the story of a fighter who refused to surrender even when her body was failing. The journey to that London stage began months earlier in Los Angeles. Judy was essentially homeless, staying with friends because she couldn't afford rent. Her 5th marriage was crumbling. She owed money to everyone from the IRS to her former managers. The entertainment industry that had made billions from her talent had moved on to younger performers. At 46, she was considered washed up, unemployable, a cautionary tale about squandered potential. But an unlikely offer came from England, a small nightclub willing to take a chance on the name recognition, even if the performances might be unpredictable. The money wasn't much, but it was something. More importantly, it was a stage, and performing remained the only thing Judy knew how to do. She arrived in London in autumn 1968 with almost nothing. 1 suitcase of clothes, a small bag of medications. No entourage, no handlers, just herself and her new husband, Mickey Deans, a younger man who meant well but was overwhelmed by the magnitude of her problems. They rented a small flat in Chelsea, modest accommodations far removed from the luxury she'd once known. Neighbors would later report hearing her singing late at night, practicing alone, her voice echoing through the thin walls. The first performance at Talk of the Town was scheduled for early December. The club's management was nervous. They'd heard the stories about Judy missing shows, appearing unable to perform, the decades of unreliability. They built contingency plans, arranged for understudies, prepared themselves for disaster. What they didn't understand was that despite everything else falling apart in her life, despite the addiction and the failing health, Judy Garland remained fundamentally a performer. The stage was the only place she had ever felt truly valued. Opening night arrived with considerable anxiety. The audience was a mix of genuine fans who remembered her glory days and curious observers drawn by the spectacle of a fallen star. When Judy appeared nearly an hour late, looking fragile and uncertain, some people in the crowd began whispering skeptically. Then she sang, and everything changed. Her voice wasn't the powerful instrument it had been. Years of smoking and pharmaceutical abuse had damaged it. But what remained carried an authenticity that technical perfection could never match. She sang about loss and longing with the authority of someone who had lived every word. Between songs, she talked to the audience in a way that broke down the traditional performer-viewer barrier. She told stories about her childhood, about the early days in Hollywood, about mistakes she'd made and lessons she'd learned. Some of these monologues rambled, revealing the effects of medication and exhaustion. But they also revealed something rare, complete honesty from someone who had spent her life performing manufactured personas. The audience, initially skeptical, found themselves drawn in by the raw humanity of what they were witnessing. The performances continued over several weeks, and each night was different. Some shows were triumphant, with Judy connecting powerfully with audiences who gave standing ovations. Other nights were difficult, with her arriving late or struggling vocally. The British press, typically harsh with fading American stars, treated her with surprising gentleness. Critics noted the tragedy of what she'd become, but also acknowledged the courage it took to keep performing. But behind the scenes, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Judy's health was failing in ways that were becoming impossible to hide. The medications that had sustained her for decades were now poisoning her system. She experienced severe insomnia, often staying awake for days. Her weight had dropped dangerously low. Mickey Deans tried to help, but found himself overwhelmed by problems he couldn't solve. Friends who visited the small Chelsea flat were shocked by the conditions, the chaotic accumulation of pill bottles, and the evidence of a life spiraling toward its conclusion. Yet she continued performing. In late December, when many performers would have taken holiday breaks, Judy kept her schedule. Christmas 1968 was spent preparing for a Boxing Day show. She had nowhere else to go, nothing else to do. The stage remained her only refuge, the only place where the past decades of exploitation and suffering could transform into something meaningful. Here's what the official accounts often miss. During these final performances, something shifted in how audiences perceived Judy. They weren't watching a polished star delivering practiced entertainment. They were witnessing something more profound, a human being refusing to be defeated despite impossible circumstances. Every time she walked onto that stage, frail and damaged but determined, she was making a statement about resilience that transcended show business. The final scheduled performance came in early January 1969. By this point, Judy could barely function. Her body was shutting down from years of abuse. She should have been in a hospital, not a nightclub. But she insisted on fulfilling her contract, on giving audiences what they'd paid to see. That last show was heartbreaking and magnificent simultaneously. Her voice was barely a whisper at times, but the emotional connection she forged with the audience was absolute. When she finished her final song that night, the audience erupted in sustained applause that lasted nearly 10 minutes. They weren't applauding a great technical performance. They were acknowledging something deeper. They had witnessed the last stand of someone who had been exploited by Hollywood but never completely broken. Judy stood on that stage, tears streaming down her face, accepting the love of strangers in a foreign country because it was the only love she consistently received. After that performance, she returned to the small Chelsea flat. The bookings had dried up. Her health made further performances impossible. She spent her final months in relative isolation, occasionally visited by friends, but largely alone with her deteriorating condition and her thoughts. The entertainment industry that had consumed her career offered no support. The studios that had made fortunes from her talent sent no assistance. She was, as she had been for much of her life, essentially alone. On June 22, 1969, Mickey found her dead in their bathroom. The official cause was listed as accidental overdose, but everyone who knew the situation understood it was more complicated. Years of systematic abuse by studios, decades of addiction, the psychological damage from childhood exploitation, all had culminated in this inevitable end. She was 47 years old, looking 20 years older, dying in borrowed accommodations in a foreign city. Here's what those final London performances revealed that Hollywood had always tried to obscure. Judy Garland was never just a troubled addict or a difficult personality. She was a survivor who kept fighting long after most people would have surrendered. Every time she walked onto a stage in those final months, knowing her body was failing, she was choosing courage over comfort. She was demonstrating that even when everything else has been taken from you, dignity remains a choice. The British public responded to her death with an outpouring of grief that surprised observers. 22,000 people eventually lined up to pay respects at her New York funeral, but it was in London where people felt they had witnessed something essential about who she really was. Not the manufactured studio creation, but the actual person underneath all those years of exploitation. Those final performances weren't technically perfect. They weren't commercially successful. They didn't revive her career or solve her problems, but they represented something more important than any of that. They showed that Judy Garland, after everything that had been done to her, could still create moments of genuine human connection through her art. That even damaged and dying, she possessed more artistic truth than most performers achieve in their prime. When people discuss her legacy today, they often focus on her classic films or her vocal abilities. But perhaps her most powerful legacy comes from those final London shows. In those performances, audiences saw someone who had been chewed up by an exploitative industry but refused to completely disappear. Someone who, even in the final months of life, insisted on being seen and heard on her own terms. The small Chelsea flat where she died has since been marked with a plaque, not by the entertainment industry but by fans who understood what she represented. The Talk of the Town nightclub is long gone, replaced by other venues and other performers. But recordings of those final performances survive, and they tell a story that transcends show business. They document the last stand of someone who gave everything to an industry that gave very little back, yet somehow maintained her essential humanity until the end. Judy Garland's final performances weren't the triumphant comeback that Hollywood movies would script. They were something more honest and ultimately more meaningful. The determined efforts of someone refusing to be silenced, refusing to disappear, insisting until her last breath that her voice and her truth mattered. That's the legacy that survives beyond all the scandals and tragedies, not perfection, but persistence, not victory, but dignity in defeat.